First of all, welcome to the lab. At least a different angle of it. Don't look at that part back there. That's the wall of shame where all the projects go to die. The video today is one you guys have been asking for since my GPU June series of Big Brother Little Brother battles. Well, specifically the one I did with the Voodoo 4 versus the Voodoo 5. We all know the Voodoo 4 and the Voodoo 5 didn't compete against each other, but with the Big Brother Little Brother battles, it made sense. Well, it so happens that the Voodoo 4 had a bloody battle with the GeForce 2 MX. In this video, we're gonna revisit that battle and see what the cards can do. This is the Voodoo 4 4500 that you guys may know from my other videos, and this is my newly arrived GeForce 2 MX that's going against this guy. The platform we're going to use to test these video cards is a 3GHz Pentium 4 in an MSI motherboard with an Intel 865 chipset and 1GB of DDR. This system is quite fast and should provide more than enough performance for a bottleneck-free setup. We're using Windows 98 as it was broadly used in the late 90s and early 2000s, and it was probably what most PC gamers had at the time. Now back to the video cards. The Voodoo 4, as we know, sports one Lonely VSA 100 chip with 32MB of SD RAM in a 128-bit bus. Both core and memory clock are set to 166 MHz. On release, it cost $179 and it was available in October of 2000, 4 months after the 3DFX flagship video card for that year was released, the Voodoo 5. Speaking of that, this is one thing that people get wrong sometimes. The Voodoo 4 wasn't a prequel to the Voodoo 5. The Voodoo 4 actually came out a few months after the Voodoo 5 to compete in the budget segment of the video card market. So the Voodoo 4 had half the processing power and half the memory of the Voodoo 5. You could basically build two Voodoo 4s out of one Voodoo 5. Just don't quote me on that. In the other corner, we have the GeForce 2 MX. Nvidia's counterpart was released in September of 2000 for $119. Yes, it was much cheaper and the specs are pretty similar to the Voodoo 4, with the chip being clocked at 175 MHz, while the memory was clocked at 166. It also carries 32MB of SD RAM with a 128-bit bus. One of the features 3DFX boasted about was that the Voodoo 4 and 5 both have the capability of doing full scene anti-aliasing. The GeForce 2, by market pressure or not, also does FSAA. In the case of the Voodoo 4, it supports 2x anti-aliasing, and that basically means that it renders an extra frame and it uses that to fill in the jagged lines so that they are a bit smoother. On 4xAA, it will do this twice, making the lines even smoother, but the Voodoo 4 only supports up to 2x, and it's barely powerful enough for that, as AA has a big performance hit with the extra frame the card is rendering. In the case of Nvidia's implementation of FSAA on the GeForce 2, they had quite a different approach. As states an article in AnandTech from 2000, instead of creating an extra frame, it renders the game at a higher resolution and downsamples it to whatever resolution you're playing at. So considering the $60 price difference from $119 to $179 of the Voodoo 4, it should have outperformed the GeForce 2 MX. As history shows it, I'm pretty sure it didn't do that. So let's revisit these video cards in a series of games I have selected from your suggestions on Twitter and on my YouTube post about this. The video cards are capable of running some of these games at 1024 by 768, but to make things even across the board, we ran all the games at 800 by 600. Expendable was released in 1998 and it's been largely used to test retro hardware because it has 16 and 32-bit color options as well as a time demo. Speaking about the time demo, it decided that it doesn't want to run today on my test system, so yeah, this will be me playing the game. Results shouldn't be too different since I've played the same part of the game for the test. I never realized this, but Expendable has an interesting opening sequence where humans are inside pods being managed by machines. Now where did I see this before? With both video cards, I ran the games in 32-bit color mode and triple buffering. Both of the video cards run the game very well at over 60 FPS. The GeForce 2MX is more stable than the Voodoo 4, which does get some dips when there are screen-wide explosion effects and things of the sort. Turning on the anti-aliasing feature, it gets a bit subjective. The Voodoo 4 only has the 2x option, while the GeForce 2MX has a bunch of options. But for the GeForce, I went with the 2x2 to try to use something equivalent to the Voodoo 4. Both look okay, but performance hit is massive with AA in this hardware. The Voodoo 4 stays mostly above 30 FPS, while the GeForce 2 manages to stay above 40 FPS most of the time. Deus Ex is another fan favorite. It's not my favorite by any means because the beginning is kind of slow and dark, so I don't think it's the best to test performance. Nevertheless, here it is in all its glory. This one was released in the same year of our video cards, 2000. In Expendable, both video cards were using Microsoft's Direct3D, but in Deus Ex, Glide is available, so the Voodoo 4 will be using Glide, while the GeForce 2 will be using Direct3D. Something to note is that I ran the game in 16-bit color for both video cards, because I was getting capture glitches at 32. And because of optimization in Glide, the Voodoo 4 gets to be a little ahead on this one, running the game above 60 FPS without anti-aliasing, and between 30 and 40 FPS with AA switched on. The GeForce 2 doesn't do too bad either, running the game at above 50 FPS, most of the time without AA, and also with a significant drop when AA is turned on, FPS is down to the mid-20s. I messed up here and I didn't use the time demo command to get the frames with the GeForce, but the Fraps yellow display is much easier to see, and with a 3GHz Pentium 4, I doubt it would make a difference in the FPS count. IGI Project, or the I'm Going In project, was a game I had never heard of before one of you suggested it for testing. Kind of looks like the original Counter-Strike, but it was released by Interloop Studios and developed in their own game engine. It was released in the end of 2000 and it looks good and runs pretty well, with the exception of when there's fog, that slows down both video cards. The game seems to be locked at 30 FPS even though VSync is off on the driver settings, and apparently there's no difference in performance between the video cards. When anti-aliasing is switched on, both video cards take a big hit to about half the original frame rates they were getting before. Seems to me like the GeForce takes a bigger hit. Not by much though, only a couple of extra frames lost. Quake 2 is one of my favorite games to test. I've always liked this game. I remember when I saw it for the first time, I didn't have a 3D accelerator at the time, so I ran it in a tiny window so I didn't lose any detail for pixelation and whatnot. It's from 1997, one of the earliest games of the lineup. Runs on OpenGL on both video cards, with the Voodoo 4 using the Mini-GL and OpenGL subset. Being an older game, it's no problem for the video cards, both of them running the game at well above 100 FPS, with the GeForce 2MX taking the lead without anti-aliasing. When AA is activated though, the Voodoo 4 takes less of a hit in this game. It's still playable on both, but the Voodoo 4 does a better job with AA, and considering the frame rate is pretty high, this is how I would choose to play this game. Naturally, we can go directly into Quake 3, released in 1999. Considering it's a bit more demanding, I say it's more appropriate as a test for these video cards. Quake 3 also uses OpenGL, and the only unfortunate thing about Quake 3 to me is the lack of a campaign. But it was still pretty cool to play this online in the early days of online gaming. This is another title in which the GeForce 2 outperformed the Voodoo 4 without anti-aliasing, and with anti-aliasing, the Voodoo 4 outperforms the GeForce 2. Considering this was a competitive game, I wouldn't use anti-aliasing with it no matter what. So going for the 90 FPS of the Voodoo 4 to the 120 FPS of the GeForce 2 is nice, but not a game changer. Serious Sam was developed by Crow Team and released in 2001. It's also a fan favorite for testing hardware, and mine as well. It has an in-game frame counter and many customizable graphical options. In 800x600, both of these video cards run the game pretty well, with the GeForce 2 being clearly ahead of the Voodoo 4 on this one. When anti-aliasing is switched on, the game becomes nearly unplayable with the Voodoo 4. And since there are no intermediate anti-aliasing options with the Voodoo 4, it's only on or off, there's not much we can do. So I would definitely play this game without any anti-aliasing on the Voodoo 4. With the GeForce 2, you have the option of setting AA to 1.5 by 1.5. That's what you see here in the screen, and it's a bit less impactful than the 2x2 we have been using. Considering this game is really fast, I would not play it with AA in any of the cases, and that is quite okay, because I highly doubt you'd have time to look at jaggy edges in the midst of hectic shootouts. Unreal is from 1998 and it was developed by Epic. It uses the original Unreal Engine. With this game/tech demo being from 1998, both of the video cards should have an easy time running it, right? The game has in-game statistics and a castle flight mode, and that makes it a really compelling game for when testing different video cards. Unreal does support glide, so there's a potential for the Voodoo 4 to perform. And it sure does. With no AA, it gets an average of 86 FPS, and with anti-aliasing, it drops to 44. As for the GeForce 2 MX, it scores an average of 72 FPS without AA, and with it, it drops to 26? Yeah, really inconsistent? Not sure why. AA was set to the same level as other games at 2x2, but it is what it is. GTA Vice City was released by Rockstar Games in 2002, and the Voodoo 4 plays this game surprisingly well for a card from 2000. In 2002, 3DFX had already cashed its chips and left the market with its last official driver being from the year 2000. So no support from 3DFX for a while by the release of GTA Vice City. The game runs at around 30 FPS with no AA on the Voodoo 4, giving you an okay playing experience, if you don't expect modern levels of frame rates, that is. With anti-aliasing turned on, the Voodoo 4 frame rates are basically halved as usual, giving us an FPS of around 15, not really playable in this state. The GeForce 2 performs with similar frame rates to the Voodoo 4, and with AA, it also runs at around 15 FPS at times. It does seem to do a tiny bit better, but we're getting in the subjective field at this point. For our last test, we have 3D Mark 99. Sometimes this kind of benchmark doesn't reflect exactly what gameplay is like, but these video cards are not that different as far as performance goes. 3D Mark 99 will not test AA. Back then, the anti-aliasing feature was so rudimentary that in many cases you had to manually switch it on in the driver settings. In my opinion, the results here do reflect reality pretty well when it comes to direct 3D. The GeForce 2 MX is in fact a bit ahead of the Voodoo 4 in that manner.
So back in 2000, I actually went in a store and bought a Voodoo 550-500 brand new. I could have gone with Nvidia, but one thing in the mind of us 3DFX owners since the beginning is that we needed something to run glide, and Nvidia cards didn't run glide. And as we saw here, 3DFX cards were usually faster than Nvidia cards when you compare glide to direct 3D. We know now that 1 year or two after 3DFX went under, glide became completely irrelevant, but at the time, it made a lot of sense to get a 3DFX card. Considering everything, considering the anti-aliasing performance, considering the glide performance and the direct 3D performance and the compatibility of 3DFX cards, I think that if I went back today, I would still have gotten a 3DFX card back in 2000. Of course, we didn't know that 3DFX was going to die, but that's just life. So, if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, give a like to the video, share it with your friends, and check out my last video here where I benchmarked a bunch of high performance AGP video cards.